Good evening. My name is Grant Mercer, and a few nights ago, my wife divorced me in front of 100 people while they held champagne and laughed. I was standing in the middle of her new law firm, the one my credit paid for, holding a glass I'd bought, wearing a suit I'd put on to be proud of her. She tapped her glass, smiled at the crowd, and called me her starter husband like it was a punchline. Then she handed me divorce papers under the city lights, and the room actually applauded. My fingers were shaking so hard I almost dropped the envelope, but nobody noticed. They were too busy admiring her bravery. I walked out without saying a word. Tell me, if your whole life was torn up in front of strangers and called entertainment, would you still stand there and clap? I didn't stop walking until the elevator doors sealed shut behind me, muting the applause that was still echoing from Celine's rooftop party. My pulse was pounding in my throat. The envelope felt heavier than the champagne glass I dropped on some server's tray on the way out. I didn't remember crossing the lobby. I barely remembered breathing. I only came back into my body when the night air hit me, cold, sharp, almost metallic. Uptown Charlotte glowed like nothing inside me had broken. Cars hummed. People laughed outside the wine bar across the street. The city kept moving, as if my life hadn't just been peeled open for sport. I reached my car and just stood there, hand on the handle, trying to steady my shaking. I wasn't crying, not yet. It was something closer to vertigo, that feeling you get when the ground gives way and your body hasn't figured out the fall. I got in and pulled on to I-277, letting the skyline fade behind me. The road blurred. My mind didn't. The applause wouldn't leave my ears. The way Celine smiled, polished, confident, as if humiliating me was nothing more than a marketing stunt. The way Marcus, a man who once knew every secret of my 20s, didn't even look at me when it happened. He just adjusted his tie like he didn't want to be caught standing too close to the guy who'd just been cut loose. I gripped the wheel harder. Maybe that was the moment that hurt more than the divorce papers, the confirmation that I'd been slowly erased long before tonight. Not just by Celine, but by everyone she'd let into her orbit. People who looked through me, not at me. By the time I turned into South End, my jaw ached from clenching it. The condo windows were dark. Celine wouldn't be home for hours. She'd be basking in whatever praise came next. Bold, fearless, empowered. None of it paid for by her credit, but praised like it was self-made. I sat in the parking garage with the engine running, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. 8 years. 8 years of paperwork, signatures, credit checks, quiet encouragement. 8 years of thinking support meant partnership. My hands finally stilled. Not because the shock had faded, but because something colder slid into place behind it. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. I walked upstairs, loosened my tie, and dropped the envelope on the kitchen island. The silence in the condo pressed in. I traced a finger along the edge of the papers she'd handed me like they were some kind of performance prop. Starter husband. She'd said it like it was clever, like I was just an opening act, a placeholder until someone better showed up. But as I stood in the dim kitchen, surrounded by the very furniture I'd paid for, the truth sharpened inside me. Celine hadn't upgraded. She'd miscalculated. Every decision she'd made tonight, the arrogance, the spectacle, the certainty she no longer needed me, clicked into place with a single, quiet realization. She didn't understand what she'd built her life on. And for the first time since the party, I felt something other than humiliation, something steady, something precise. She had no idea what happens when the foundation walks away. And I wasn't going to warn her. I didn't sleep that night. I just stood in the kitchen, lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum while the city glowed faintly through the blinds. The divorce papers sat where I dropped them, a clean white square against the granite. So I should have felt empty. Instead, memories started rising one by one, slow at first, then with the force of a dam breaking. 8 years. 8 years of saying yes because I thought love was supposed to stretch farther than fear. I pulled out the old file box from the hall closet, the one Celine always joked made me look like an old accountant. Spreadsheets, folders, loan documents with colored tabs. At the time, I'd thought I was being organized. Now I realized I'd been documenting the exact shape of my own downfall. The first page on top was a loan application dated 2015. Her handwriting, my signature. I could still picture her that night at my kitchen table in my old apartment in South End. She wasn't Celine the lawyer back then. Just Celine in an oversized UNC sweatshirt, hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes fever bright with ambition and fear. "Grant, I can't get approved," she'd said, spreading the papers like battle plans. "My credit's shot. They want a co-signer with steady income, just until I graduate. I'll refinance everything once I'm established." I'd believed her. Not because she promised, promises are cheap, but because I saw how badly she wanted out of the life she'd come from. She wanted more than survival. She wanted to matter, and I wanted to be the person who helped her get there. I could still hear Elaine Carter's voice the day we finalized the loan. She'd pulled me aside at the bank with that steady, quiet tone of hers. "Mr. Mercer, I know the numbers. You're the stability here. Just make sure both of you understand what that means." I did. Celine didn't. Or maybe she did, and simply assumed the foundation wouldn't ever shift. I flipped through the next documents. $15,000 for bar prep, signed at midnight while Celine panicked about passing. Then $37,000 for the LLM program she insisted would set her apart in corporate law. Each one stamped with my credit. Each one tied to my name if she defaulted. I kept turning pages. The wardrobe line, $25,000, because I have to look like I belong in those rooms. The tech financing, $40,000 because clients expect professionalism. The software subscriptions, monthly fees that stacked up like quiet bricks. She'd thanked me then, earnestly. She'd held my face in her hands and said, "You believing in me is the only reason any of this is possible." And back then, it felt like a partnership. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between the late nights, the firm promotions, the corporate events where I became invisible, gratitude turned into expectation. Then expectation into entitlement. And tonight, entitlement into spectacle. I set the file down and leaned against the counter. I wasn't angry about the money. I never had been. What broke something inside me tonight wasn't the financial ledger. It was realizing she'd rewritten the story in her own mind. In her version, she climbed alone. In her version, I was just a stepping stone. The condo was silent, but my chest felt full of noise. 8 years of overlooked moments crowding in all at once. The time she corrected someone for calling me a finance guy, insisting I was more like a consultant, not really in the corporate space. The conference, she said, wasn't spouse-friendly. The jokes she made about my predictable routines, as if stability were something to be embarrassed by. Somewhere in those years, Celine stopped seeing me as a partner, and I had been too patient, too trusting, too willing to fade into the background while she stepped into the light. I didn't realize it until now, but I'd been slowly erased. The high point of the chapter hit me all at once. This wasn't a marriage that cracked tonight. It was a marriage that had been tilting for years. And tonight, she decided to knock out the final support beam. I looked at the stack of papers again. Every loan, every guarantee, every sacrifice I labeled as our future. If Selene wanted to call me a starter husband, fine. But a starter is still the one who begins the engine. And the person who builds the foundation always has the power to pull it back. The thought settled into me like steel. Tonight wasn't the end. It was the moment I remembered everything she'd forced herself to forget. And when the sun came up, I would start making calls. Morning came without mercy. Light pushed through the blinds like it was trying to expose every truth I'd ignored for years. I didn't bother making coffee. I just stood there, elbows on the counter, staring at the file box as if it were a mirror finally showing me the right reflection. If Chapter 2 was the record of everything I'd signed, Chapter 3, this chapter, was the record of everything I'd missed. The slow erosion, the quiet rewrites, the moments too small to fight, but too sharp to forget. They came back in flashes, each one carving a little deeper. The first was the night Selene got her offer from the mid-sized firm in Uptown, a huge deal for her, a turning point. We celebrated with takeout on the balcony of our South End apartment. I remember telling her how proud I was, how she'd earned it. She kissed me, but her eyes drifted toward the skyline. "Grant," she'd said, laughing softly, "you have no idea what this means for us." But the us started shrinking after that. The next flash, a networking gala at the Mint Museum. I stood beside her while she introduced everyone else with titles, accolades, Ivy League backgrounds. When it came to me, she hesitated just long enough for me to feel it. "This is our Grant," she said, waving a hand lightly. "He works in finance." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at them to see if they approved. Then came the conferences. The ones she claimed weren't spouse inclusive. At first, I accepted it. I even encouraged her to go. But one night, while she booked another trip, she said something that dug under my ribs and stayed there. "It's just easier if I go alone. My colleagues, they don't really bring their spouses unless there's a certain image involved." A certain image, meaning not me. But the sharpest memory, the one that burned hottest, was the night she came home late from the firm. I'd waited up with dinner half cold on the table. She breezed in, phone in hand, heels clicking across the floor. "You didn't have to wait," she said, distracted. "We grabbed drinks after closing arguments. Marcus was there. It was good networking." I asked, quietly, why Marcus never told me he joined her work circle. She looked at me like I'd asked the wrong question entirely. "Grant, your world and my world aren't the same anymore. That's not a bad thing. It's just reality." Reality. As if I were the one out of place in my own marriage. Marcus had once been my closest friend. We'd split rent in our 20s, shared the same beat-up couch, survived the same stupid mistakes. But somewhere between Selene's rise and his own climb at Caldwell and Byron, he shifted. He stopped texting back, stopped asking about my work. At events, he'd talk past me, not to me. The first time he called Selene a rocket in this industry, he didn't even glance at me to see how it landed. He'd chosen his orbit, and it wasn't mine. But the memory that pushed everything over the edge, the high point of this chapter, was a conversation months before the party. We were at a courtyard wine bar with some of her associates. Selene was riding high off a big client win. Grant's been amazing, honestly, she said, swirling her glass. He takes care of the boring stuff so I can focus on the real work. The real work. As if my contributions were invisible scaffolding, useful but unworthy of acknowledgement. One of her colleagues, a partner named Colton, laughed. That's what husbands are for, right? Support beams. You upgrade the furniture later. Everyone chuckled. Selene didn't correct him. She didn't even flinch. She only took another sip of wine. And there, finally, the pattern snapped into focus. It wasn't that Selene had changed overnight. It wasn't sudden cruelty or a single betrayal. It was the slow, steady rewriting of our marriage until I was no longer a person, just a placeholder, a stepping stone, a starter husband. And I'd let it happen because I thought supporting her dreams meant I couldn't question how she treated mine. I pressed a hand against the countertop and breathed in slowly, letting the truth settle, heavy but clarifying. What happened at the rooftop party wasn't an explosion. It was the final, polished presentation of a choice Selene had been making for years. She'd already practiced diminishing me. Tonight, she simply did it with better lighting. But standing there, remembering every moment I'd swallowed, every subtle cut I'd brushed aside, something shifted inside me again. Humiliation was no longer the sharpest feeling. Recognition was. I saw the full timeline now, and I saw exactly where it ended. Not with my collapse, with hers. Because a foundation can carry weight for a long time, years even, but once it cracks, everything built on it starts to tilt. Tonight, I finally stopped pretending I didn't feel the tilt, and tomorrow, I'd let gravity do the rest. By the time the sun finally dragged itself over the skyline, I was past anger, past humiliation. What settled inside me was something steadier, sharp, level, almost surgical. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to match Celine's theatrics with my own. I was going to do what I did best. Run the numbers. Follow the paper. Let the truth speak in signatures and clauses. I showered, dressed in the same suit I'd worn to her rooftop celebration, and sat at my desk with the file box open like a dissection table. Pages spread out in neat rows. Highlighters uncapped. Laptop glowing. I wasn't reliving the past anymore. I was auditing it. Every loan, every credit line, every temporary support she'd sworn she'd refinance someday. I re-examined all of it with a different pair of eyes. Not the eyes of a man in love. The eyes of a man who had been set up for a clean exit without being notified. The numbers were undeniable. Selena's practice wasn't built on her brilliance alone. It stood on the backbone of my credit. I clicked open the first contract and felt a grim, centered calm settle in. Equipment financing agreement. Primary borrower, Selene Caro. Guarantor, Grant Mercer. Clause 14b. Guarantor may withdraw support upon material change of circumstances. I didn't need a legal degree to know a public divorce announcement qualified. Next file. Office lease guarantee. Tenant, Caro Legal Group. Guarantor, Grant Mercer. Clause 9c. Guarantee may be terminated with 30 days' notice following dissolution of marital or business partnership. Funny how she never read that far. Then the business credit line, the software subscriptions, the insurance underwriting, all tied to me, all anchored by my name. Somewhere between page 20 and page 40, the whisper inside my head grew louder. She really thought you wouldn't do anything. She thought a man who supported her quietly would stay quiet forever. She mistook restraint for weakness. I opened my email and dialed Alden Price's number. He answered on the third ring, voice groggy. "Grant?" It's barely 7. I need you to review everything I've signed for Celine. Every guarantee, every backing. I want the withdrawal options, effective dates, penalties, everything. A pause. A long one. What happened? She served me divorce papers in front of her colleagues, made it entertainment. Alden exhaled slowly, a sound halfway between disbelief and anger. I'll be in the office within the hour. Next call, my accountant, then the bank. Elaine Carter picked up personally. She always did when the matter touched high-risk guarantees. Mr. Mercer, she said, tone calm but alert. I saw your message. How urgent is this? Urgent enough that I need separation of liability as soon as possible. Another pause, then a quiet, knowing reply. I suspected something was wrong the moment I heard her firm opened. Without you mentioned anywhere, I'll prepare the notices. Elaine had always understood the math, better than Celine ever cared to. I started drafting letters while my coffee sat untouched. Each withdrawal was a clean incision, legally sound, professionally worded, impossible to contest. The language came naturally, like my hands already knew what needed to be done. Effective immediately. In accordance with Clause 14b, change of circumstances, termination of guarantee. 17 letters. 17 support beams pulled from beneath a structure built on borrowed stability. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th draft, the high point of this chapter hit me. A realization colder than anything I'd felt the night before. Celine had spent years convincing herself she didn't need me. But legally, practically, structurally, she needed me for everything. And she had just declared in front of a rooftop full of people that she no longer wanted my involvement in her life. So I was giving her exactly what she asked for. No malice, no theatrics, just math. By the time the clock hit 9, the letters were printed, signed, and sealed. I lined them up across the dining table like dominoes waiting for the first flick. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Celine used a microphone last night. She needed an audience. Me? I'd let certified mail deliver the message, and gravity would handle the rest. The clerk at the post office didn't know she was handing me a weapon. She just stamped each envelope, 17 in total, with that heavy, decisive thud that echoed deeper than it should have. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. Proof that I wasn't running, hiding, or hesitating. I walked out into the crisp Charlotte morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Uptown shimmered in the distance, all glass and ambition, the perfect place for illusions like Celine's to thrive. But illusions don't survive paperwork, or deadlines, or the blunt force of financial reality when the guarantor steps aside. By noon, the dominoes had started to fall. The first call wasn't from Celine, it was from the bank. Mr. Mercer, the loan officer said, we're notifying Ms. Caro she must secure new collateral or pay down the balance within 30 days. Your withdrawal triggers reassessment. I thanked him, hung up, and waited. The equipment financing company emailed next. A sterile message, no room for interpretation. Without my guarantee, the remaining balance on her computers, servers, and legal software was due immediately, $42,000, or the equipment would be reclaimed. Another brick pulled out of the structure. Then, around 3, Elaine from the bank called again. Her professional liability insurance flagged the change already, she said calmly. They'll terminate coverage effective immediately. I sat back in my office chair, letting that sink in. No insurance, no law practice. It was that simple. Law wasn't a profession that tolerated gaps. No insurer meant she couldn't take clients, draft contracts, appear in court, or even give legal advice. One canceled policy and the entire engine seized up. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just breathed. This was the math doing what math always does, revealing truth without emotion. But the emotional fallout arrived soon enough. At 4:13 p.m., my phone lit up with Selene's name. I let it ring out. She tried again, and again. On the fourth attempt, I picked up, not out of kindness, but because silence would have held too much power. I wanted her to hear the steadiness in my voice. "Grant," she said, breathless. I got several notices today. Something's wrong." "Is it?" I asked, turning away from the window as Uptown glimmered behind me. "Seems like the system is working exactly as arranged." Don't be cryptic," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "These letters are serious. You can't just withdraw everything. My practice could shut down." "That sounds like a you problem." A sharp inhale. I could picture her standing in that expensive office, the one with glass walls that made sure everyone saw her rise, walls that would now let them watch her fall. "Grant, stop this. We need to discuss things like adults." "You already discuss things," I said, on a rooftop with a Birch microphone while people laughed. "That was poorly handled," she admitted, "but you can't destroy my business because your feelings were hurt." There it was, the line that snapped something clean inside me. "My feelings didn't send out those notices," I replied. "Contracts did. Clauses you never bothered to read. Consequences you assumed you'd never face." She went quiet, then lowered her voice. "You're being unreasonable." "I'm being proportional." Her composure cracked. "If you pull all your guarantees, I could lose everything." "You should have considered that," I said, "before you made a spectacle of the person underwriting your entire career." Silence stretched thin between us. And then, faintly, another voice in the background, Marin. Of course, Selene had probably run to her practice group for support, painting herself the victim of a dramatic husband instead of the architect of her own ruin. "Grant," Selene said, softer now, "please, come home so we can talk." "I am home," I said. "You left long before I did." I hung up. For a moment, the office felt impossibly still. I could hear my heartbeat, steady as a ticking clock. Downtown Charlotte buzzed outside, business as usual, people stepping into elevators, legal clerks grabbing coffee, bankers rushing between meetings. But inside one boutique law firm, panic was spreading like a crack through glass. By sundown, 3 more notices had landed in Selene's inbox. The ripple effect was in full motion. What held everything together wasn't her degree, her image, or her network. It was me. More accurately, my credit, my stability, my foundation. And I had finally stepped away. The high point of this chapter struck me as I shut down my computer. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had built her entire empire on the belief that I never would act. And now she was learning, hour by hour, exactly what collapses when the foundation decides it is done being invisible. Selene didn't call the next morning. She didn't text either. For a few hours, Uptown Charlotte moved around me like nothing in my life had shifted. Elevators chimed, analysts rushed past my office door, sunlight hit the glass towers at sharp angles. But beneath that calm surface, I knew Selene's world was unraveling thread by thread. The first call came at 10:07 a.m. Her number flashed across my screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Grant," she said, voice clipped, controlled, professional in a way that told me she was already surrounded by people. "We need to talk about these withdrawal notices. Not hi, not can we talk, not I'm sorry. Just business." "You received them then?" There must be some misunderstanding, she said. These documents, my firm can't operate without these guarantees. You can't just pull them because you're upset. I leaned back in my chair, watching the skyline shimmer through my window. 39 floors above the city, the same room where I'd signed half the documents she was now panicking over. I didn't pull anything because I'm upset, I said. I withdrew because the primary relationship supporting those guarantees has changed. You mean the divorce? She snapped. That doesn't void financial agreements. You know that. Actually, I replied, in several of these contracts, it does. Material change in circumstances. Alden confirmed that. Silence. Then, you called Alden? No, I said. I called my attorney. Alden just happened to be the one most familiar with the documents. His personal connections aren't my concern. There it was, the first crack. A shaky breath, barely audible. Grant, don't do this. Not like this. You did this, I corrected. You're the one who announced the dissolution of our marriage in front of 100 people. I'm simply aligning the legal paperwork with your public statement. She lowered her voice, and I heard the shift, the switch from partner to attorney, from wounded pride to professional threat. If you go through with this, I'll have grounds to sue. Interference with business relationships, intentional sabotage, breach of marital duty. You're exposing me to liability with clients. I laughed, quiet, almost surprised. Celine, you humiliated the person guaranteeing your insurance and loans in public. On video, if any of your colleagues had their phones out, if you want to go to court and explain why you served your husband divorce papers as a party stunt, be my guest. That's not how this works, she hissed. The financial commitments are separate. But your circumstances aren't, I replied. And divorce is a change in circumstances. Every lawyer in that room knows it. She inhaled sharply. I could picture her pacing her office, hand in her hair, the framed certificates behind her trembling with each uneven breath. The image didn't satisfy me. It just felt inevitable. Grant, be reasonable. We can negotiate. We can find middle ground. Just tell me what you want. There it was. The question she should have asked before everything cracked. I let it sit between us for a moment. What I want, I said slowly, is for you to understand the difference between confidence and contempt. You thought humiliating me would make you powerful. It didn't. It only freed me to stop holding up the part of your life you pretended you built alone. She swallowed hard. This isn't you, she said. You're not vindictive. I'm not, I agreed, but I am done being taken for granted. Her voice faltered. Grant, please. If you continue, both of us lose. No, I said. This isn't mutual. You're the one who built everything on a foundation you didn't respect. I lose nothing by stepping away. You lose everything you placed on top of me. She didn't speak. I heard only soft, shaky breaths. Then, what will it take for you to stop? A foundation, I said, only supports what honors it. A pause, a soft, broken whisper. I don't understand. No, I said, you never did. I ended the call, and as I stared out at the city, her city, the one she thought she'd conquered, I realized the peak of this chapter wasn't the argument. It was the truth settling in. Celine had always believed we held equal power. But power isn't in who shines the brightest. It's in who holds the ground. And for the first time in 8 years, she finally saw where I stood. She showed up without an appointment. My assistant buzzed my line late that afternoon, her voice cautious in a way I wasn't used to hearing. Mr. Mercer, there's a Ms. Caro here to see you. She says it's urgent. For a moment, I just stared at the phone. Celine never came to my office, not once in 8 years. My world had always been too ordinary, too quiet, too far beneath the altitude she preferred to breathe in. "Send her in," I said, my voice steady. The door opened, and the first thing I registered was how small she looked. Not physically. Celine had always carried herself like she owned every room she walked into. But now her shoulders were tight, pulled inward. Her usually perfect blowout was scraped into a messy ponytail. She wore jeans and a wrinkled blouse, clothes that didn't match the meticulously curated image she fought to maintain. But the part that hit hardest was her face. She'd been crying. "Grant," she breathed, closing the door behind her like she was shutting out a world on fire. "Please, we need to talk." I gestured toward the chair across from my desk, the same chair where she once sat. Handing me documents, she said, would change our future. Back then, she'd smiled at me with complete certainty, as if my signature were just part of the natural order of things. Tonight, she sat like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. "My insurance is gone," she started, hands trembling as she raked them through her hair. "Do you understand what that means? I can't take cases. I can't advise clients. My bar association portal already shows a compliance alert." I nodded once. "Yes, that tends to happen when coverage lapses." "Don't do that," she snapped, but the spark died as quickly as it came. "Please don't pretend you didn't know this would happen." "I didn't pretend anything," I said. "I sent withdrawal notices. The consequences are theirs, not mine." She blinked back another wave of tears. "The bank wants $67,000 by next week. The equipment company is threatening to repossess everything. My research subscriptions locked me out this morning. I can't even draft a reply brief for a deadline tomorrow." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time in days, something in me softened. Barely, but enough to recognize the woman I once believed in. The woman who had sat at my kitchen table years ago, overwhelmed and hopeful and terrified. The woman who asked me to believe in her. But that woman had disappeared long before tonight, replaced by someone who held a microphone and called me disposable. I folded my hands on the desk. "What do you want, Celine?" She swallowed hard. "I want to fix this. I want you to reverse the withdrawals." "Why?" I asked quietly. "Because you suddenly value me again? Or because you finally understand what I've been holding up?" Her eyes filled, but she didn't answer. I opened the drawer and pulled out a folder, thick, worn at the edges, filled with every document I'd signed for her. I placed it between us like evidence. "Do you remember the first time you asked me to co-sign something?" I asked. "You told me you just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." She nodded, barely. "I meant it." "I know you did," I said. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing the difference between support and servitude." She flinched. I continued. "You built your entire professional identity on the illusion of independence. But the truth? You never stood alone. You just stopped noticing the person standing beneath you." "Grant, I know I hurt you," she whispered, "but destroying my career." "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm stepping out of the role you assigned me. You made it clear you didn't want me involved in your life anymore. I'm honoring that." She shook her head, eyes wide and pleading. "I didn't mean it like that." "You meant it exactly like that," I replied. "You wanted freedom without consequence. But freedom always comes with a bill, Celine. You just never expected it to come due." She sat in silence, the weight of everything collapsing around her, settling into her posture, her breathing, her trembling hands. Then, quietly, "What do you want me to do?" This moment was the true climax of the chapter. Not her begging, not her fear, but her finally asking a question I'd been waiting years to hear. "What I want," I said, "is simple. I want you to understand what you threw away. I want you to acknowledge that your success wasn't built alone, that it stood on a foundation you decided to ridicule." She looked away, jaw tight, shame blooming across her face. "I can't tell them that," she whispered. "I can't admit that publicly. It would destroy my reputation." "Your reputation," I said softly, "is already shattered. You just haven't accepted it yet." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands covering her face. "How did I get this so wrong?" she said, barely audible. I answered honestly. "You started believing your own story." We sat there in silence, her world breaking, my world steady for the first time in years. Finally, she stood. Her voice was small, raw. "Please, Grant, I'm asking you not just as your wife, but as someone you once loved." I met her eyes. "You were never unlovable," I said. "You were just careless with the person who loved you." She left my office without another word. And for the first time since the rooftop party, I felt something close to peace. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just the quiet certainty that I had finally stepped back into my own life. Celine had built an empire on a foundation she didn't respect. Tonight, she finally saw what it looked like without it. The call came the next morning, just after 7, when Uptown was still stretching awake and the sun was catching on the glass towers like fire. I recognized the name before I even picked up. Marin Price. Not Celine. Not Marcus. Not any of the people who laughed the night she handed me divorce papers like a party favor. Marin, the woman who had stood beside Selene at the rooftop event, the one whose polite smile never hid the calculation in her eyes. She was part of Selena's circle, the same circle that rewarded image, punished weakness, and protected itself above all else. I answered anyway. "Grant?" Marin's voice was steady, but there was strain underneath. "We need to discuss the situation with Selene." I almost laughed. Situation? That was their word for collapse. Something vague, something that avoided admitting the truth. "I wasn't aware there was anything left to discuss," I said. "Don't do that." Her tone tightened. "You know your withdrawals have created complications." "For whom?" "For everyone." The mask slipped for a second, irritation bleeding through. "Referrals, joint clients, cases we plan to coordinate with her firm. Your actions impact more than just Celine." There it was, the real reason she was calling. Not concern, not empathy, not justice, reputation management. "Marin," I said, "if your network didn't know Celine's practice depended entirely on my credit, that's not my deception. It's hers." A pause. A long one. Then, "Is that really the angle you want to take?" "The truth?" I asked. "Yes, I'm comfortable with it." She sighed, the sound of someone who led with authority for years and wasn't used to being told no. "Look, Grant, what happened at the opening was inappropriate. I don't think anyone is defending that." I raised an eyebrow even though she couldn't see it. "Inappropriate?" I repeated. "Your husband's colleague laughed the loudest." Silence again. They were all complicit. Maybe not in the planning, but in the performance. Celine handed them a spectacle, and they rewarded her for it. "Fine," Marin said stiffly. "It was unprofessional, but you're taking this too far." "I'm aligning my financial liabilities with my marital status," I said. "That seems reasonable." Grant, she can't replace $223,000 of guarantees overnight. That's not my problem to solve. Her voice hardened. This could end her career. It could, I agreed. Actions do tend to have consequences. Another silence. This one longer, colder, heavier. Then she dropped her voice, shifting tactics. What do you want? There it was again, the question everyone eventually reached when their leverage ran out. What I want, I said, is for Celine to tell the truth, to her colleagues, to her network, to anyone who believed she built her empire alone. You expect her to humiliate herself? You mean, I asked, the way she humiliated me in front of 100 people? That's different, Marin said flatly. It always is, until it isn't. She exhaled sharply. Grant, be serious. She'll never agree to that. Then she can buy out my guarantees. $223,000? Marin said, incredulous. She doesn't have that kind of money. Then she's not independent, I said. She never was. And it's time everyone knows that. The line went quiet long enough that I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, the fight had drained from her voice. This isn't about money, she said quietly. Is it? No, I said. It's about respect. Another pause, a colder one this time. You're going to let her fall, she said. She jumped, I corrected, and I ended the call. But the day wasn't done. Around lunch, I received a message from Marcus, my former best friend, now one of the bystanders who treated my humiliation like an uncomfortable but unavoidable social moment. Hey man, heard things are rough. Maybe we should talk. Grab a drink? I deleted it without replying. People like Marcus only reach out when they smell smoke and want to make sure the fire won't spread to them. Not because they care, not because they regret, but because they want to stay on the right side of the narrative. By afternoon, the calls stopped coming. Silence settled over everything, thick, heavy, expectant. It wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet right before a structure finally caves in. As I left my office that evening, uptown glowing in the distance, I realized the climax of this chapter wasn't the phone call with Marin. It wasn't Marcus pretending to rediscover loyalty. It was the shift. For the first time since the rooftop party, Celine's world wasn't expanding. It was contracting, tightening, closing around her mistakes. And she was learning, slowly, painfully, that you can't build your future on a foundation you mock, not without the ground eventually opening beneath you. 3 months passed before I realized I'd stopped checking my phone for Celine's name, not because I expected her to call, those days were gone, but because somewhere between the legal filings and the quiet evenings alone, the reflex had just disappeared. The silence that once felt sharp now felt clean. Her world, meanwhile, didn't collapse all at once. It folded slowly, like a structure losing tension one beam at a time. First came the message on the legal newsletter I subscribed to for work, just a short line in the career movement section. Celine Caro joins Whitfield and Marsh, Gastonia office, a small firm outside Charlotte. An associate position, not partner track. Her starting salary was listed in a way only insiders would notice. $48,000. Less than half of her loan obligations, less than a tenth of what she'd boasted she would earn on her own. The woman who once introduced herself with polished confidence now had a title that wouldn't impress anyone outside a 10-mile radius. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. No surge of victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Gravity had done exactly what gravity does. By then, the divorce had finalized. She didn't contest anything. Not the house, not the accounts, not the separation terms. She couldn't afford the fight, and she knew it. My attorney, my new attorney, someone sharper than Alden and without ties to her network, walked me through the paperwork with a calm efficiency that felt like closure. I kept the house, the South End condo with the balcony where we'd once dreamed out loud, the place where I'd signed every loan application, believing I was building a shared future. Now it was just mine, and it felt strangely larger without her ambition filling it. I turned her old home office into a library, not out of spite, but because the room needed a new purpose, and so did I. Shelves went up where her degrees had once hung. Books filled the spaces where she stored binders and billable files. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window with a light on and a strategy book in my lap, the quiet settling into me like something I'd forgotten I knew how to feel. My consulting firm grew too. 3 new clients signed within months, each one telling me, in different words, that they respected how I handled a difficult personal situation. Apparently, having boundaries was good for business. People notice steadiness. They notice who keeps their word. And sometimes they notice who refuses to be used. One afternoon, while I was grabbing coffee at a place near the bank, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mr. Mercer." I turned. Elaine Carter stood there, holding her own cup. Same calm expression, same steady presence. "I read the notices you filed," she said. "Clean work." I gave a small nod. "Thank you, and thank you for your help." She studied me for a moment, then said something that stayed with me long after she walked away. "Some people confuse support with servitude. You corrected that." I didn't have a reply. She didn't need one. The next week, I got a letter from Celine, not a formal one, handwritten, folded twice, tucked into an envelope with my name on it. No return address, no legal jargon. She wrote that she was sorry, that she'd gotten caught up trying to impress the people around her, that she forgot what mattered, that she hoped we could someday be friends. I read the first paragraph, maybe 2. Then I set it down, folded it with care, and dropped it into the trash. Some bridges don't burn in flames. Some just rot from neglect. By the time you look back, there's nothing left worth crossing. Last week, during a drive through Uptown, I passed the building where Celine's firm once stood, the boutique office she decorated with marble coasters and glass conference doors. The sign was gone. A yoga studio was moving in. They'd painted the walls a soft green. A better use of the space. I parked for a moment across the street, watching workers carry in boxes of mats and speakers, fresh starts for people who wanted them, clean slates for those who earned them. I wasn't angry anymore, not bitter, not vengeful, just grounded. Celine had called me her starter husband. Maybe she meant it as an insult. Maybe she thought it made her sound powerful. But standing there, watching someone else remake the space where she once stood so sure of herself, a thought settled quietly into place. Some foundations get taken for granted, some get torn down, and some walk away long before the building falls. When they do, they reveal exactly what they were holding up, and what was never going to stand on its own.